All right, this is Libertarian Overwatch, and we're doing something a little bit different today. We're going to be looking at some articles discussing the color revolutions in the time that they were occurring. And to do that, I figured I would make this a little bit of a series, especially because I have some journalists in mind who were able to cover quite a few of these revolutions and things like that. And today we are going to be starting with Justin Raimondo of antiwar.com. And if you have not read Justin's stuff, I highly recommend it. I have been reading his articles from the archives, which start back in around 1999. And so he's able to cover a lot of the stuff right in time when we're talking about the USS Cole bombing, when we're talking about September 11th. We're talking about these different events that are very crucial to just the history of the U.S. as a whole, really. And Justin, even if I don't necessarily fully agree with some of his takes, he's always interesting, always entertaining. It's rare to never that I'm bored by a Justin Raimondo article. And so today we're going to talk about his article from September 29th, 2000, where he is talking about the Bulldozer revolution as it's happening on the ground. And so he is kind of responding here to an article that is discussed called NATO Game Plan Destabilize Yugoslavia. And so here's something I really love about Justin's writing too, is he always keeps those hyperlinks, which I think is fantastic. Even though at this point, a lot of these hyperlinks are dead, you're going to need to throw that into Internet Archive, and then you'll be able to get exactly what you're looking for. As someone who's been looking at a lot of the revolutions, a lot of those youth groups, those websites don't really exist anymore, but you're able to go back, check out what they were saying in 2001, what they were saying in 2002. You know, in particular, I'm thinking of Zubair for Belarus's youth group. So one of the things that I think about this article that stood out to me, and we talked about this a little bit in the interview I had with Scott Horton recently. We talked about how Justin's perception of the color revolutions at the time was very different by what his conclusion was as soon as 2006, especially as we started to see these revolutions kind of stack one on top of the other. I know I've dove into a couple of different ones in the intervening years between 2000 and 2006, but the ones that really stand out, of course, are Serbia in 2000 with Bulldozer, 2003, Rose Revolution with Georgia, 2004 with Ukraine, the Orange Revolution, and I would say Lebanon, the Cedar Revolution kind of stands out as well in there, and of course the Kyrgyzstan Tulip Revolution. So one of the things that I really want to point out here is when we're talking about the different perceptions, is at this point, Justin is pointing to this. He's saying that essentially in the article that George has posted, that the claim is that this is all a CIA, NED, George Soros conspiracy theory, and that maybe those 200,000 people that are seen on the ground, maybe he doesn't even see those people, things like that. So I think this goes into a few important things that I want to discuss here. One is kind of the agency on the ground, and two is protest numbers. So let's talk about the protest numbers real quick. These change source to source. These change, day to day, and it's really hard to gauge some of these things. I want to say when I was researching Azerbaijan, we were looking at some articles were saying 15,000, others were saying 20,000. So, I mean, a 5,000 person difference, and it's very hard to tell these things. So that's why, if I'm able to, I like to hyperlink both of them. So this source says 3,000, this source says 5,000. So I think that's something important to note, that these numbers are very variable, and especially in Belarus. That's one where there was a big protest at the start, but as it started to go down, much less was on the ground, things like that. But you still had some people, and it was covered by some of the local radio stations and things like that. They were able to show some photos of kind of that overnight raid at the very end of the Belarus and the Jeans Revolution. But anyways, so that's kind of the crowd source, or crowd sizes rather. Now, the other part I want to hop into is the agency of the people on the ground, because I do think that's something that's very important. In most of these revolutions, you're having very legitimate grievances from people. I would say the Philippines and Madagascar are the ones that stand out to me as the most domestic ones. And that's not to say that the other revolutions aren't very domestic. A lot of people were very upset with what they were seeing from their who was in charge in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Kyrgyzstan. And what I'm trying to do with my articles, and I think in general what people who discuss the color revolutions should focus on, is what are the mechanisms behind it? You know, what kind of money is going into these different sources and things like that. So that's something we're going to cover a little bit today. So what I am now going to do is I am going to share the article that Justin was talking about, because I think giving some context regarding that would be very interesting and worthwhile. So here's the article here using Internet Archive. It is NATO game plan, destabilize Yugoslavia. One part I wanted to point to, because as we go down here, we have, and I found this number very interesting because I've not seen this number really anywhere else. I know on the Carnegie Council, they had mentioned $77 million. But everywhere else that I've seen, we're looking at like the 30 to 40 million range. So I don't know if this is going into overall, if we're looking at things like overall funding from different agencies and stuff. So not just USAID, NED, things like that. If we're looking for like outside sources, if we're looking for overall, medical purposes, if we're looking for the State Department. I don't know exactly where we're quite reaching that number. But I do think it's an interesting article where it talks about some of the voting mechanisms, where it's talking about things like NATO's role in all this in the Bulldozer revolution and just geopolitical importance that Yugoslavia and Serbia plays in the greater role of things. So I do think that's interesting and worth showing. Now, the next thing I kind of want to cover here is we're going to look at what some of the papers were saying at the time. So especially when we're looking at things like the Washington Post, when we're looking at things like, the Post is going to be the big one for this one. So let's go to that article from the Post because I do think that is very, very important to share. So here is our article about the Post. And this one is worth mentioning that this comes out 3 months after Justin writes that article. This comes out in December of 2000. But Justin was mentioning things like CIA, NED, the Soros societies and things like that, if they played a role, if it's all just a giant conspiracy. And so when you're reading things like the Post from kind of an establishment source, I think it's important to highlight some of the things that are mentioned here. So one of the things that really stood out to me is this sentence here, where we say that some Americans involved in the effort said they were aware of CIA activity at the fringes of the campaign, but had trouble finding out what the agency was up to. So, and then below it, it goes into the USAID, the NED, the IRI, all different groups that I'm sure at this point, if you've been keeping up with the Color Revolution series, are very, very familiar with. So, and as we go down here, this is the part that I find very interesting. So as we were talking about the agency of the protesters and things like that, and not wanting to take away from them because there's legitimate reason for people to be upset and frustrated in these situations. Here's the parts that I find very interesting is when you have U.S. funding going to youth groups in different countries. So in here, we can see in March, the IRI, chaired by John McCain, is paying for around 24 outpour leaders to meet and to go over nonviolent resistance methods. So, and I do want to mention this very briefly, but Burma, when we get to 2007, the Saffron Revolution, which is what I'm currently working on and covering, it's mentioned very briefly with Helvey and with Gene Sharp. And in fact, Gene Sharp is actually saying the reason why these revolutions were kind of unsuccessful is they didn't really take to my words and my methods with the 88 generation students and things like that. So, but this article I found was just very, very important to the overall grand scheme of things. And this is where you get the specific mention, I want to say, where you have, not 31, but where you have, there we go, 41 million in democracy building and things like that. This article right here from Michael Dobbs is just stellar in covering everything that went into this revolution, things like that. And especially like right here, we're looking at the U.S. taxpayers that are paying for 5,000 cans of spray paint used by student activists and things like that. So, if the people themselves on the street want to do these kind of things, I think that's very fair. When we're funding it, it becomes a little bit of a different question, or the 2.5 million stickers with the slogan "He's finished," especially in today's economy, there are people struggling to make ends meet. I don't know why we're sending 2.5 million stickers to Serbia. Maybe that's just me. But super interesting article here, and very, very in-depth. And I want to say, let me see if this is the article too that I was thinking of. Yeah, we have specific mentions of the Clinton administration and things like that. And look like quotes like this. I always find that the Post and especially like the Wall Street Journal in 2005, their article about Kyrgyzstan, phenomenal, where they're talking about Mike Stone, where they're talking about Freedom House and things like that. And when the printing press went down and just the methods that they went to get the printing press back on to print opposition papers. And I've mentioned it before, I must mention it here because it's just a phenomenal documentary. But USA Conquest of the East, the 2005 French documentary, it goes even more in depth in that particular case, where it starts to talk about how the IRI and John McCain is actually on the phone with some Kyrgyz leaders, and they're talking about, hey, we're really upset about this. Like, we need that printing press term back on. And then, the translated version of it, they said, oh, we're so sorry. We're going to do whatever we can to upload, to keep up with democracy and things like that. So that's all very interesting. This Washington Post article, like I said, I really want to highlight this article because it's very fantastic, very thorough, really covers the whole revolution, I think. This article is just a great way to end it. And it's a lawyer who was working for OPOR. This is the first time that we felt that Western governments were actually trying to get rid of Milošević. So that article is very important. Like I said, this comes out about 3 months after Justin's article, so I think that's an important context to note, where he may not have had some of that information at the time. But that article is very important. And then we're going to look at this other article here because I think this one is also worth mentioning. Not that one. We were just talking about that one. The next one we're going to talk about is actually going to come from the LA Times. And so with the LA Times article, what we're going to be looking at here is kind of the role that open societies played in the revolution. So let me share my screen here for this one. All right, here we go. So this one is from the LA Times. And as we go on here, it kind of just discusses the role open societies played in the whole revolution and things like that, and how it helped finance student organizations like OPOR. And so I think quotes like this are just super essential to the whole story. Most of our work here was done undercover, and you get a lot of those quotes in the New York Times and things like that. The New York Times described the Belarus Zubair, their first meeting was as like an undercover meeting in a park and things like that. And I believe it's also Belarus, they were talking about a campaign that was getting started. In fact, I think this might even be the same article, but they were talking about how they were taking apart the memory card and they're disassembling their phone because they're like, oh, they're listening. They're recording everything that we're talking about right now. So the opposition was, pretty paranoid of what kind of state repression could happen at any given time. So there's a lot of great quotes about how they're kind of functioning in like an underground kind of way. In the case of OPOR, it eventually becomes very mainstream. Maybe not the funding sources behind it. That kind of gets revealed a little bit later, but OPOR was kind of everywhere with those cans of paint, with the stickers and things like that. So this article just kind of gives some background into George Soros and things like that. And it talks about the role, like I said, the role that is played with OPOR. I think this part's very important, and I mentioned this in my Rose Revolution article, where Soros had both Nazi and communist oppression, and so when he says he wants an open society, I genuinely believe that. Anyone who's lived through those kind of situations, I can't even begin to imagine what that must have been like. And as we go along, like I said, it just really gives us some really good stuff about the revolution and things like that. What kind of role was played. And that's kind of what I'm looking at here is the facts behind it all. And I think Mark McKinnon does an excellent job with this in his book about the new Cold War, where he's talking about how the youth group in Georgia was actually started up by a $350,000 grant from OSF. I had to look for a few different sources for that, and I want to say it was Al Jazeera, I believe, that also kind of backed that up, or the BBC. It was one or the other when I was doing my research on that. But so those are some sources that I just wanted to kind of throw out there to kind of talk about this a little bit to give some context. So kind of my conclusion here is that Justin at the time is unaware of some of this stuff. And I mean, that's totally fair. These articles came out a little bit later about what role these played in here. And this is also not me saying that this is NED, a Soros conspiracy, This is me instead saying, here are some of the facts on the ground. Here's some of the specific numbers that were added. We're not going to go to that 70 million number because that cannot really be corroborated except from one singular source, where we have the Post and we have some other sources that are mentioning those $30 to $40 million numbers, which I think appears a lot more realistic. Finding numbers for funding can sometimes be difficult. Thankfully, in Burma, there's a Burma campaign, and it's a UK PDF that has all this information. And in that, they specifically have $15,000 goes towards monk training and things like that of non-violent resistance. So it's very, very out there and telling you like, hey, this is where the IRI funding is going. This is where the NED funding is. And I was like, man, if only I had this information for all of these, I'd be set. But instead, I have to dive into more sources than you can imagine to develop some of these articles. But it also kind of goes into the vote a little bit, talking about some ballot stuffing and things like that, instances of fraud. The other part I kind of want to dive into here is when we start to talk about Otpor. And so he says, the student group Otpor has been singled out for special attention by the smear campaign conducted by Milosevic's American Fan Club, a group whose platform, as described by the slanderers, doesn't match anything on Otpor's website. Perhaps they got their information directly from Milosevic's secret police. In any case, do we really want to see these people set up for state repression in the name of free speech? No. And I think this is something that Justin will kind of later have a little bit more nuance to his approach. But yeah, absolutely not. I think that groups like Otpor, groups like Camara, groups like Pora, groups like Zubair, groups like Obrana, all these groups, I think they have legitimate grievances. And I think, being able to show those grievances, freedom of speech, being able to say, hey, I don't want to stand for this. Let's meet together. Let's protest this. Zubair had so many different protest methods. The one that I'm looking at right now in Burma, they have all these different campaigns, these letters that they wrote and things like that to kind of capture everything that they are currently upset with the current regime. So the issue for me comes in where it's the funding of these mechanisms from the U.S. saying, hey, here's millions of dollars to, as we saw in that Washington Post article, to use spray paint, to use stickers, to do these kind of things, So that's kind of my conclusion in total when we're looking at this Bulldozer Revolution article, is that I think by the time we're getting to some of those later revolutions, Justin's having a lot more of a different perception. And I think it's just once we get that new information and things like that. But it is very interesting looking at this article in hindsight when we're looking at this compared to some of those other revolutions and things like that. And so, yeah, that's my conclusion on the Bulldozer Revolution here. It's the one that kind of started it all for me. This is the one where, like I said, $41 million quoted in the Washington Post there. There's also an article, I believe, with the Financial Times where they dive into Bill Clinton and him saying, well, if CIA did it, then I wouldn't have too much of a problem with it, that kind of a thing. Super in-depth article on that one. I do believe it's Financial Times. But go check my Substack article about it. I have it all in there as well for us. But in conclusion, that's the Bulldozer Revolution. And this is Justin Raimondo's article discussing it. Like I said, definitely worth a read. We have all the hyperlinks there, and you're able to kind of take in his perspective at the time. It's really a good capture of a moment in time. So if you enjoyed this, please let me know. I am planning on covering some of the other ones. This one we disagreed a little bit, but I also gave him benefit of the doubt where I said, hey, I think that his perception may have changed by the time we've gotten around to some of these later revolutions. I will say, when we get to Ukraine, there's a discussion about the poisoning situation, and I think we're going to have much different conclusions. Much different. But anyways, if you enjoyed this, please let me know. I do plan on doing some more in the future because I had a fun time reading over this. Anytime I get an opportunity to read Justin Raimondo, I'm down for it. So please leave a comment. Tell me what you think about this, and have a great rest of your day.